Welcome to Session 2 of the Provider Adoption Series. I'm Dr. KJ. In the first session, we briefly covered the history of the electronic medical record, and we set the foundation for a deeper dive into the complexities of merging the practice of medicine with modern clinical and business technologies. Progressing through our previously posted agenda, this session will build on the foundation set in the previous course and will focus on general patterns of technology adoption in the healthcare provider space, and we will specify reasons why physicians don't adopt, even when presented with benefits or confronted with penalties. This should provide significant context for identifying and fencing our parameters around this problem. Australian researcher Roy Morgan can be credited for conceptualizing a segmented bell curve to the generalized adoption of technology. Interestingly, this adoption life cycle was first identified in 1957 in an agricultural research program by Beal and Bowen entitled Diffusion of Innovations. Note that neither front-end innovators nor antiquated legacy holdouts are represented in this graphic. To give deference to the original spirit of this segmented curve, we will summarize the real-world application of the original narrative to allow you to draw parallels to your own practice or work habits. For instance, innovators, not shown on this slide, had larger farms, were more educated, more prosperous, and more risk-oriented. Early adopters, they were younger, more educated, tended to be community leaders, but were less prosperous. Early majority, they were more conservative, but open to new ideas, active in the community, and influential to neighbors. Late majority, older, less educated, fairly conservative, and less socially active. Finally, laggards, very conservative, had small farms and capital. They were the oldest and least educated. As a cultural note, neo-Luddism is a philosophy opposing many forms of modern technology. The term Luddite is generally used as a pejorative applied to people showing technophobic leanings. Always the first to purchase and use technology early adopters are typically well educated with both high incomes and risk-taking tendencies. This model expresses how the adoption coefficient is maximized in the late majority segment, with early adopters and laggards really balancing out the curve on both ends. We will revisit this curve later in the segment. We will spend a few moments on this slide so that we can understand several of the forces at play in our adoption problem. Quoting the Gartner website, the Gartner Hype Cycle methodology gives a view of how technology or application will evolve over time, providing a sound source of insight to manage its deployment within the context of specific business goals. So this can easily be used when determining the viability of a new healthcare innovation, such as addressing the adoption curve, which we looked at on the last slide. But first, we're going to crosswalk the Kelly and Connor's emotional cycle of change with the Gartner Hype Cycle to identify subjective decision influencers. First, uninformed optimism. So this correlates to the upward slope of the peak of inflated expectations. Noted here is the perceived usefulness, and this was defined by Fred Davis as the degree to which a person believes that using a particular system would enhance their job performance. Next is informed pessimism. So this is the downward slope. This is a critical point in the process, as there are two identified ways for team members to figuratively check out. So if you check out publicly, you may voice your criticism or point out objections and then just leave. But if you check out privately, you will lose interest, become ambivalent about the situation, and reduce your involvement. Crisis of meaning or hopeful realism. This is located in the trough of disillusionment. This is going to be very critical in the next couple of slides. So here's where you will either cancel the project or acknowledge that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Informed optimism correlates to the plateau. Having moved to the growth curve, you might find yourself able to assist others that are stuck in earlier segments of the cycle. So business patterns like this are very common in everyday life. For example, this is very similar to the 4 stages of situational leadership in organizational management. There you would find the first phase is directing, second is coaching, third is supporting, and fourth is delegating. And that plays out very nice in the hype cycle. And just to drive home that these patterns are prevalent everywhere is you'll find they're now ensconced in your lifestyles as well. For instance, if you were in a grief cycle, your first part of that cycle would be denial, and then anger, and then depression, then bargaining, and then acceptance. Matches very nicely to the hype cycle. Looking at a real-world example, we see that a provider's voice can really get lost in the complexities of building out a true enterprise solution. Here we have all of the same segments of the hype cycle clearly tagged at a high level with multiple programs and projects required to achieve this CMIO's vision. If we were to match them up, the technology trigger could be seen as legacy technologies. The peak of inflated expectations might be the vendor's vision. The trough of disillusionment may be where the real world dynamics really start to hit. And then you have your gap fill and your hotfix management. And your slope of enlightenment, this is where you're going to have your dynamic integrations. And then finally, the plateau of productivity, you'll find your best fit and internal compliance. As promised earlier, we will now circle back to see the relationship between the Gartner hype cycle and the technology adoption curve. Note that the early adopters have identified the gaps in legacy systems. It could be said that the crisis of the trough of disillusionment is forced when early majority decides to join. Here, when many voices that come on board identify many problems, and either solutions are generated or the project is scrapped. The late majority begins signing on when expanding interoperability and large-scale rollout makes the technology available to an expanding audience. Finally, the laggards get on board when the vision nears completion and most everything is all buttoned up. So, what excuses or valid reasons might push a provider so far down the curve as to be a laggard? According to the 2020 qualitative study by Duda and Wang, a rigorous research study to identify those reasons was conducted through 5 major academic databases, including ProQuest, Web of Science, PubMed, Scopus, and the Cochrane Library. Identified here are the 25 core reasons that physicians choose not to adopt an EMR, whether at enterprise level or at a freestanding practice. These are listed in order of instance from highest to lowest. I'm only going to read the first column. Privacy and security concerns, high startup costs, workflow changes, system complexity, lack of reliability, interoperability, lack of customizability, lack of usefulness, too time-consuming, high maintenance costs, lack of incentives, organizational culture change, lack of standards. The list goes on. Certainly, you've identified that there's a bit of subjective overlap between some of these elements. Still, the concepts are pretty straightforward, and those of you already in health informatics workspace have probably heard a few of these yourselves. When I was initially researching this as a lecture for a university focus group, I decided to speak to my own primary care physician. Interestingly, in a typical office visit, he only gives me about 12 to 15 minutes, but when I told him about my research and I asked him why he chose to keep his practice on paper, he had quite a bit to say about the subject. Honestly, he stood on his soapbox for an additional 10 minutes, preaching to me about why EMRs are the devil. With no prompting from me, he spoke explicitly to each of the items highlighted here in yellow. Catching me off guard, he admitted that in his practice, it was worthwhile to stay on paper and take the Medicare penalties. Therefore, he could maintain a rapid pace of patient throughput. So his first concern was that it was time-consuming. In the ambulatory setting, well-formatted paper documentation can be reduced to a series of checkboxes, simple phrases, and signatures. In his words, if I use the EMR, then I'm treating the computer and not the patient. He specifically spoke of the salesman's interoperability lie, and his quote was, "We were all promised that if our patient gets sick in Florida, they could pull up her record right there and take action." So masking the name of the following organizations, he went on to say Hospital X and Hospital Y, both local here, but they both use the same electronic medical record, but their systems don't speak at all. Ultimately, his most profound concern was his lack of trust in the stability of the organization's EMRs. Although we are all now somewhat familiar with those 25 issues as seen through the eyes of the physician, we must realize that the bureaucratic, political, and governmental influences also play a significant role in the determination of healthcare technology adoption. This means that a provider's input is only a voice in the choir when it comes to adopting an enterprise-level healthcare business suite. Compounding issues might include fears of ransomware vulnerabilities, political pressures to adopt a favorite system, enterprise acquisitions, very common, vendor marketing tactics, disruptive new technologies such as AI, and regulatory pressures. Additionally, we could have an entire lecture just covering sanctions for non-compliance, but we'll save that for another day. This concludes this section on provider patterns. In our next segment, we will shift gears and address other players in the marketplace. For instance, the impact and influence of adoption through a vendor's perspectives. Please reach out to me at kjyoung@healthcarerepairllc.com to continue the conversation. Remember to heal the process. Session adjourned.